Before the Fellowship was the greatest story you've never heard. I'm Dan.
I'm Greg.
I'm Cameron.
Join us as we read and react to the Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. If you like what you hear, go ahead and rate us 3 Silmarils out of 3. Am I supposed to read that right now?
Sure.
Yeah, why not? Follow us everywhere at Before the Fellowship and send any comments or questions to beforethefellowship@gmail.com. We've met the Lords of the Earth, the Valar, and the Queens of the Valar, and the Maya, and now we're starting a new chapter. That is Quenta Silmarillion, The History of the Silmarils, Chapter 1. Of the Beginning of Days. It is told among the wise that the first war began before Arda was fully shaped, and ere yet there was anything that grew or walked upon earth. And for long Melkor had the upper hand. But in the midst of the war, a spirit of great strength and hardihood came to the aid of the Valar, hearing in the far heaven that there was a battle in the little kingdom, and Arda was filled with the sound of his laughter. So came Torkus the Strong, whose anger passes like a mighty wind, scattering cloud and darkness before it. And Melkor fled before his wrath, and his laughter, and forsook Arda, and there was peace for a long age. And Torkus remained, and became one of the Valar of the kingdom of Arda. But Melkor brooded in the outer darkness, and his hate was given for Torkus for ever after. In that time, the Valar brought order to the seas, and the lands, and the mountains, and Yavanna planted at last the seeds that she had long devised. And since, when the fires were subdued or buried beneath primeval hills, there was need of light, Aule, at the prayer of Yavanna, brought 2 mighty lamps for the lighting of the Middle-earth, which he had built amid the encircling seas. Then Vada filled the lamps, and Manwë hallowed them, and the Valar set them upon high pillars, more lofty far than are any mountains of the latter days. One lamp they raised near to the north of Middle-earth, and it was named Illuin, and the other was raised in the south, and it was named Ormel. And the light of the lamps of the Valar flowed out over the earth, so that all was lit as if it were in a changeless day. Then the seeds that Yavanna had sown began swiftly to sprout and to burgeon, and there arose a multitude of growing things, great and small, mosses and grasses and great ferns, and trees whose tops were crowned with cloud as they were living mountains, but whose feet were wrapped in a green twilight. And beasts came forth and dwelt in the grassy plains, or in the rivers and the lakes, or walked in the shadow of the woods. As yet no flower had bloomed, nor any bird had sung, for these things waited still their time in the bosom of Yavanna. But wealth there was of her imagining, and nowhere more rich than in the midmost parts of the earth, where the light of both the lamps met and blended. And there upon the isle of Almaren, in the great lake, was the first dwelling of the Valar, when all things were young. And new-made green was yet a marvel in the eyes of the makers, and they were long content. Now it came to pass that while the Valar rested from their labors, and watched the growth and unfolding of the things they had devised and begun, Manwë ordained a great feast, and the Valar and all their host came at his bidding. But Aule and Torkus were weary, for the craft of Aule and the strength of Torkus had been at the service of all without ceasing in the days of their labor. And Melkor knew of all that was done, for even then he had secret friends and spies among the Maya, whom he had converted to his cause, and far off in the darkness he was filled with hatred, being jealous of the work of his peers, whom he desired to make subject to himself. Therefore, he gathered to himself spirits out of the halls of J.R.R that he had perverted to his service, and he deemed himself strong. And seeing now his time, he drew near again to Arda, and looked down upon it, and the beauty of the earth in its spring filled him the more with hate. Now, therefore, the Valar were gathered upon Almaren, fearing no evil, and because of the light of Illuin, they did not perceive the shadow in the north that was cast from afar by Melkor, for he was grown dark as the night of the void. And it is sung that in that feast of the Spring of Arda, Torcus espoused Nessa, the sister of Orome, and she danced before the Valar upon the green grass of Almaren. Then Torcus slept, being weary and content, and Melkor deemed that his hour had come, and he passed therefore over the walls of the night with his host, and came to Middle-earth far in the north, and the Valar were not aware of him. Now Melkor began delving and building of a vast fortress deep under the earth, beneath dark mountains where the beams of Illuin were cold and dim. That stronghold was named Utumno. And though the Valar knew naught of it as yet, none the less the evil of Melkor and the blight of his hatred flowed out thence, and the Spring of Arda was marred. Green things fell sick and rotted, and rivers were choked with weeds and slime, and fens were made, rank and poisonous, the breeding place of flies, and forests grew dark and perilous, the haunts of fear. And beasts became monsters of horn and ivory, and dyed the earth with blood. Then the Valar knew indeed that Melkor was at work again, and they sought for his hiding place. But Melkor, trusting in the strength of Utumno and the might of his servants, came forth suddenly to war, and struck the first blow, ere the Valar were prepared. And he assailed the lights of Illuin and Ormel, and cast down their pillars and broke their lamps. In the overthrow of the mighty pillars, lands were broken and seas arose in tumult. And when the lamps were spilled, destroying flame was poured out over the earth. And the shape of Arda, and the symmetry of its waters and its lands, was marred in that time, so that the first designs of the Valar were never after restored. In the confusion and darkness, Melkor escaped, though fear fell upon him. For above the roaring of the seas, he heard the voice of Manwë as a mighty wind, and the earth trembled beneath the feet of Torcus. But he came to Utumno ere Torcus could overtake him, and he lay hid. And the Valar could not at that time overcome him, for the greater part of their strength was needed to restrain the tumults of the earth, and to save from ruin all that could be saved of their labor. And afterwards they feared to rend the earth again, until they knew where the children of Ilúvatar were dwelling, who were yet to come in a time that was hidden from the Valar. Thus ended the Spring of Arda. The dwelling of the Valar upon Almaren was utterly destroyed, and they had no abiding place upon the face of the earth. Therefore they departed from Middle-earth, and went to the land of Aman, the westernmost of all the lands upon the borders of the world, for its west shores looked out upon the outer sea that is called by the elves Achaia, encircling the kingdom of Arda. How wide is that sea? None know but the Valar, and beyond it are the walls of the night. But the east shores of Aman were the most utter end of Belegia, the great sea of the west. And since Melkor was returned to the Middle-earth, and they could not yet overcome him, the Valar fortified their dwelling, And upon the shores of the sea they raised the Pelori, the mountains of Almaren, highest upon earth. And above all, the mountains of the Pelori was at that height upon whose summit Manwë set his throne. Taniquetil, the elves named that holy mountain, and Olose, I don't know how to say that, everlasting whiteness, and Elarina, crowned with stars, and many names beside. But the Sindar spoke of it in their latter tongue as Amon Olios. From their halls upon Taniquetil, Manwë, and Varda could look out across the earth, even into the furthest east. Coolio.
Mm-hmm. One thing I was thinking as we were reading this that I recall from the first time I read it was how confusing the geography is, or what the world is.
Yeah.
And I think I always go back to the music, the vision that they saw of the music, and there's kind of these phases of the world where there's the original, intact music before Melkor's disturbances, and then he's involved in it, and then there's kind of the final theme. And what is confusing from what we've read so far is that the music of the Ainur is kind of like, in very broad strokes, the entire history of everything. But then now we're getting a little bit more focused into specific details. So there's overlap with what we've already heard, which is a little bit confusing. But I think the Earth maybe isn't even spherical at this point. There's a lot of rending that happens.
Or maybe another way to say it is what you're familiar with if you've ever seen a map of Middle Earth, to not think of that.
Right.
Right. Like have a blank slate and just think of, so we've heard about two trees that are at the center, and that's all I know. And there's a shadow in the north.
Yeah. And the lights, I remember thinking, oh, maybe those lights, when I first read, maybe those two lamps are the sun and the moon. And then they're spilled over and fire destroys the earth. So they're not the sun and the moon as we know them. They were just lights. And they are gone forever, which is kind of confusing. But I think what this chapter is getting at is this process of creation, and Melkor / Morgoth doing his best to corrupt it, and in his attempt to gain power and to control, the best that he can do is just to, start these conflicts with the Valar and mess with their work and try to destroy it.
And he builds his first fortress, Utumno.
And gathers to himself minions.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't know what they are, really.
Not the Rise of Gru minions, but
right. They come later. They're a key part of a later story.
You've heard of the Maiar.
One thing that struck me reading this again. So when the two lights are overthrown, or they're just knocked over, I guess, and fire spilled over the earth.
Where's the fire? What part is that?
It's kind of in the middle there. So this, I guess, mainly what this is talking about, the Spring of Arda, which is kind of that initial act of creation where everything is new and even green. The new green of plants.
Rotting things, right?
Right. It amazes the eyes of the makers. It says they were a marvel. The new made green was yet a marvel in the eyes of the makers, and all things were young. And Melkor started in his present. He makes his stronghold, and then when his hatred starts to overflow, and all these terrible things start to come up, and then it says, came forth suddenly to war and struck the first blow, and cast down their pillars and broke their lamps. And then it says, when the lamps were spilled, destroying flame was poured out over the earth. And what I found interesting was this very next sentence. It says, And the shape of Arda and the symmetry of its waters and its lands was marred in that time, so that the first designs of the Valar were never after restored. And it just
Never
makes you
after
wonder.
restored.
Right. There was something distinct about what they created in the first place from what we know.
Original sin. What?
Well, you know, yeah, we what we know from Lord of the Rings and the way that the Earth is in that story, it's not exactly what we're looking at here, like we kind of said. But it's interesting. I like that word, the symmetry. The symmetry was destroyed. There was something beautiful about the symmetry that existed in this created thing, but it was destroyed. And again, connecting it to the music, you know, these perfect harmonies and everything were present in the music to begin with, but then they were distorted by Melkor. And I think that's interesting because, you know, the world as we know it, our actual world and Middle Earth as we know it in the Lord of the Rings, part of the asymmetry of creation is like something that makes it interesting and beautiful, like the mountains and the seas. And, you know, there is something beautiful about just kind of the design of it all, right? And I think that's part of what's, at least this is what the reading spoke to me, was the symmetry was destroyed in its waters and in its lands, and it was never restored to that, but it was built up again in in its own new and beautiful way.
Yeah, it's like making something beautiful out of something that went wrong. It's that theme that we keep coming back to.
Mm-hmm.
And there's certain things that we want symmetry in, or that still have symmetry, and the symmetry is beautiful, like a church. A beautiful church will have that symmetry. A face that doesn't have an eye like 1 inch higher than the other eye. So yeah, that one word, I see how that spoke to you.
Yeah, and yeah, it's like we do find things beautiful that are symmetrical. Spheres, for example, like when we look at the moon, we're enamored by it, but we're both enamored by a full moon and a half moon, which is less symmetrical than the full moon, even though there's still a kind of symmetry to it. Or like a, you know, looking out at a mountainous range, like there's symmetry within like a lack of symmetry. If you've ever been to California, where the fault lines are, you see these just beautiful structures that have been just torn up and like ruined by a fault line where lands are colliding together. But yet it inspires in you like a sense of like, wow. And you can't take your eyes away from it. It's weird how we like both the symmetrical and that which is not.
Can we just say how much of a boss Toolkiss is? Love that guy. Shout out to Toolkiss.
He's pretty cool.
If you're listening to this, Toolkiss, you know, shout out to you.
His laughter just filled. His laughter filled all of Arda when he came into.
And all the chat.
Melkor was terrified, and he only struck when Toolkiss was asleep.
Yeah.
I love how he like fights against Melkor, you know, becomes one of the Valar upon Middle Earth, and then espoused the sister of Arome. He's just a boss, just comes in, wins a battle, gains
takes
a wife,
a lover,
takes a nap,
and then takes a nap. Like, yeah, it's like, yeah, reading that, I was like, whoa, that's like that's intense. All right, dude.
I've been awake for like 1,000 years. I'm pretty tired.
I love it. It's awesome. Yeah. What's the other thing? There's something else in this. It's just like they're like, what are they doing when Melkor's like, okay, now's the time. I gotta. Now's my chance to just like mess things up. What are they doing at that time?
They're just resting. It seems like they're just content with the creation.
No, they were gathered, weren't they?
Yeah, they were gathered with the trees, but that's kind of where they lived.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then so you have this like, shadow in the north. That never goes away, does it? There's always a shadow in the north, even into the time of Lord of the Rings, right?
Well, there are things. So I know we just said like the world as you know it, the geography as you know it. Don't consider any of that. But there are things that kind of persist, like
North,
his
south, east,
stronghold
west.
Utumno, which is in the north of the continent, and that is kind of his permanent dwelling in the stories.
Yeah, and there is a strongholds in the north as well, a dark strongholds in Middle Earth in the Lord of the Rings. And Utumno, that's his first stronghold, but it won't be his last. I don't know how well, we're going to find out kind of what happens, but exciting things to come. But Utumno, is that in the north right now?
I believe it is. Yeah.
But it's cool that it can't be discerned by even Manwë. Like you hear about the Valar who, like Manwë and Varda, when they're together, like they can hear and see basically everything.
Mm-hmm.
And Ulmo, through Ulmo through the waters can discern anything that the water is near or touches. But Utumno is so deep and hidden and dark that it's out of their perception, which is just a cool image to keep in mind.
Yeah, it like so in the Encyclopedia of Arda, it says it's located in the far north of Arda, but the meaning of the name, though never explicitly given, is probably underworld. The great deep place. So just for context,
I cannot wait to read Baron and Luthien, but we got to get about halfway through the book to get there.
Dang. How far through the book are we? It feels like we've read hours and hours.
In my copy,
so this is. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, well, you can say your part.
Give us a visual. Give us a visual, Cameron.
Yeah.
Hold it up so that we can see.
I mean, we're just beginning chapter 1. We haven't even finished chapter 1 of.
That's how far we're at. So 36 pages out of 300. Yeah, about 300.
Why is it already like infinitely interesting?
I know.
That doesn't make any sense.
It's so epic.
Is it it's because we know Lord of the Rings and Hobbit? That's why.
I do wonder what it would be like to read this if you had no knowledge of Lord of the Rings or anything. I think it would still be.
Yeah, it's just. So I've heard it said that no one has perfected naming characters like Tolkien has. The names are just perfect. And his descriptions of the characters are just so colorful and interesting that
the description fits the name as well.
Yeah. And so when the characters interact, it creates this epic scenario of like Tulkas, you hear his laughter all across the air and the breath of Manwë, and
that's a good
cool images.
That's a good point, because like he created a language and created a naming system. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever looked into the meaning of your names, Cameron, Gregory, Daniel. But like, if we were characters in the book, our names and our meanings of our names would be intimately tied. So, just for the sake of humor, Cameron, what would your name? What would you be?
Okay, you know what my name
means. I forget. I genuinely forget.
You know what my name means, but I'm going to turn it back on you.
No, I don't.
And no, here's what's about to happen. I'm going to say the meaning of my name.
Okay.
And it's going to absolutely put your names to shame.
Okay, go on. Wait.
I am the true Tolkien fanboy because of what my name means. Okay. So, my first name doesn't really matter.
Just first name. What does your first name mean?
Okay, Cameron means crooked nose.
Okay, all right. So you'd be like a jester or something who had a crooked nose.
Last name.
Okay, Greg, how about you?
Hold on. This is so cool. I found this out just a couple years ago. my last name means horse lord, lord of horses, which is the same name as Rohirrim. That's what Rohirrim means in the mythology, in the Lord of the Rings.
Okay, so Cam's a jester. Greg. What does Gregory mean?
Gregory means watchful.
Okay, so you'd be like somebody who
Manwe,
keeps
right?
vigil.
He
and,
sees
like,
everything.
Yeah.
Manwe, yeah, that's cool.
And then mine would be probably a conflicted character because Daniel means God is my judge. So it would be linked to some kind of conflict.
Namo or Mondos.
Yeah, Mondos, yeah.
Mandos,
Kind of-
yeah.
So Crooked Nose, maybe that's like what Middle Earth looks like after they fight.
Yeah.
It's the symmetry. It's like it's never the same. And I actually have kind of a crooked nose. I don't know if you can tell.
Not really.
Okay.
But anyway, I think this is a great place to end. What does your name mean, and what character would you be written as? So, if you like what you hear, go ahead and rate us 3 Silmarils out of 3. That's 5 stars in most places. Follow us everywhere before the Fellowship, and send any comments or questions to beforethefellowship@gmail.com. And join us next week as we read the greatest story you've never heard, The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien.